بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد. 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 اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على حبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with everyone. It's a pleasure to be back with Sheikh Yasser. Inshallah, Sheikh Osama will be joining us very soon. I want to start off today, as always, by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, to purify my intentions, Sheikh Yasser's intentions, Sheikh Osama's intentions, and the intentions of everyone who's following along with us during the premiere and listening to this afterwards, inshallah. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this a time and a gathering of nur, of blessings, a time that He is pleased with us, and a time that counts for us on our scales of good deeds on the day that we meet Him, inshallah, and that He guides all of our hearts and our tongues and our ears to speak the truth and know the truth and hear the truth, and inshallah act on what's truthful and good and right. Bismillah. So I wanted to do a couple of different topics today, if Allah wills that we have enough time to get to them. The first one I wanted to start off with is what we titled on the flyer, Balancing Between Unity and Accountability, but to give it some framing and to clarify what it is that I want to sort of bring up to the shiuch. There's been a conversation in this country since the events at the Capitol last Wednesday. And this is a conversation that comes up often in any group setting, in any communal sort of group of people, which is when you have rising divisiveness and you have rising tensions within that group, to the point where one portion or one subset of the group is transgressing against the other in some way, or maybe two groups are transgressing against one another. There always comes a time where the conversation has this debate between, should we be merciful to keep the group together, or do we have to sort of have a level of accountability for each other to make sure that things just don't go wild. So that the conversation in the country for the last week or so has been, between people on one side of the political aisle saying, we understand what happened was wrong and it was a tragedy and all that, but these people have there's some long-standing history here, right? It's not like it just happened last Wednesday, right? There's a lot of stuff that happened before it, and we have to take into account what these people are experiencing. And there's plenty of people in this country who feel like they're disconnected from the leadership, and they bring up all sorts of grievances, many of which may be very legitimate. And then you have people on the other side of the political aisle saying, that's all fine and good, but these people tried to storm the Capitol and they beat police and they broke into government buildings, and there was real threats on people's lives, it seems. So you can't just let that stuff go, right? Otherwise you just have chaos. Now, I don't know that either myself or Sheikh Yasser or Sheikh Osama will feel confident or comfortable having like a definitive conversation on what has to happen in the country right now. But this question comes up so often in any communal space, and it certainly comes up within the Muslim community and on all sorts of our different institutions that we have. And I'm sure many people who listen to this probably have had this come up at work too, right? Like where, there's always small political nuanced transgressions that happen between people at work. And there's like this sense of like, well, at what point does a leader have to just let the team sort of heal and come together? And at what point does a leader have to sort of take strong stances against people's behavior? And so I thought a good place to start was to at least just, put out a generic question of, did we see both examples from the Prophet's Sirah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? And or, if Sheikh Yasser wants to start us off a little bit differently, what would be your general sort of reflections based on, the Sunnah and the Quranic ethos?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Jazakallah khair. I think this is a really interesting question to explore. We find this particular concern prevalent, or this tension, I think you will, is prevalent in so many different spaces. You can find it in governmental spaces, you can find it in workspaces, you can find it in the masjid space and Muslim institutional spaces. There's constantly, when you're dealing with the human condition and you're dealing with people and their wills and their desires, it's very common that you're going to have conflict and you're going to have disagreement. And it's very common that you may have real tension, and the potential for real discord. And I think it's important to just kind of note that, almost because people tend to be almost terrified of the idea of discord, as if any semblance of discord happens, or any type of disagreeing or vehement disagreement, then this is somehow an inherently blameworthy thing. It's a part of the human condition for people to disagree. um, I think the real challenge becomes, for the most part, when we no longer have mechanisms to adjudicate meaningfully our affairs. And when we remove principles, constitutions, the Sharia, etc., things that become kind of a touchstone for you to say, okay, well, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, if you dispute over a matter, he says, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ. If you find yourself disputing over a matter, then then return it to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there is a touchstone. There's a place to go back to assess, well, what is right here, what is wrong. You and I may come into a business arrangement, and we've parted ways in terms of our opinions of what this business is or what's happening. Not parted ways means that we left each other, no, but we kind of veered off. Everyone kind of went
You grew
down one
apart a
way.
little bit.
We grew apart. That's what I want to say.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khair. We grew apart, and then it's like, and then we have two very stark opinions about what is and what is not, and things like that. You want to go back to your business contract, your arrangement, your agreement, like what is and what is not, and who's owed what, and like it. So when we leave things to become just purely a battle of wills and opinions and shahawat and nufus, without having a touchstone that grounds us and something that we can go back to, I think that's where a lot of the chaos lies. And it seems to be, and this is me just now kind of throwing out some conjecture, it seems to be in our kind of in our current spaces, in the way in which we think about governance and relationships and people. Every single person's opinion has a type of exaggerated value to it, meaning that, because I have an opinion, because it's my opinion, then therefore my opinion is inherently of meaning, and it has to be negotiated and has to be considered, and so then I advocate for my opinion because it's my opinion, and I'll fight for my opinion, and I don't have any barriers to advocate for exactly what I think, almost throwing away principle, almost throwing away, constitutions, and the actual, like, fortified, agreed upon value system or beliefs that we have something to go back to. That's why in tanazatum farudduhu, go back to, you know. So I think that's kind of my initial reaction to what you said, but
Yeah.
I don't know if that.
No, so I think it's a great starting point, right? That you have to have an agreed upon set of principles, and or mechanisms or rules or laws or agreements that you can go back to. And I want to come back to that in a moment. I did want to start with your last point about people having outsized opinions, or opinions that have outsized weight, right? Sometimes, like, I can tell you when I'm in a position of responsibility in different places in my life, right? People's opinions can weigh heavier on my decision making than they may need to, for the simple fact that if I want to keep people together, sometimes I have to worry myself with how a certain person is going to react.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, if person A, if I come down on person A, so person A is in the wrong, right? They're doing something that's harming someone else on the team. But if I come down on them by the letter of the law, I may lose them entirely. Right. And maybe the problem doesn't warrant that I lose them.
Yeah.
Right. I'll just use a real life example that's also going on right now. I don't know if Sheikh Yasser, follows the NBA, right? But there's a very well-known team, right, that has a star or a superstar who's just gone missing now for more than a week, right? He just
Really?
Yeah, Kyrie Irving of the Brooklyn Nets just decided, I don't know what it was, a week and a half ago, something like that, that he just wasn't feeling well and decided not to come into work and hasn't been back to work since. And at least the reports that are coming out, that the communication hasn't been very clear from him to his team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, this is nobody can do that with their work. I mean, you don't,
Okay.
you have a job, you're supposed to be there, and you have teammates and you have other members. There's not just on a basketball team, in any job, you have teammates, you have other people that get impacted by you being missing, right? So you owe it not just to your employer, but to your fellow employees to either be there if you can or have a good explanation as to why. And there's a sense of conversation around the team that, well, if they really come down very hard on Kyrie, you might just lose him because he just seems to be the type of person who gets very sensitive about this stuff, right? And I can relate to that because I've seen it firsthand. Like there are plenty of times where this person's opinion is meaningless at the end of the day, right? What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. But if they are not emotionally managed well, right, according to their personality and the way they feel right now and so on, you can end up losing them, right? And I know this is a part of the conversation in the country right now, which
Yeah.
is like, yeah, all these people who are upset, they're upset for a reason. That's the argument. I'm just giving the argument. They're upset for some legitimate reasons. If you don't hear them out, if you don't hug them, right, proverbially or figuratively, and let them feel like they're heard and cared for, you're just going to lose them, and you're going to push the country further towards this division, right? So sometimes, while the person's opinion holds no weight morally, right? Like it doesn't matter that you think what you did was right last week; it was still wrong, right? But if you do have to sometimes consider the emotional management of people,
Yeah.
and that adds another layer, another challenge. I don't know what you would say to that, given
No,
what
I,
you just
I mean,
mentioned.
so I have like a bunch of thoughts rushing through my mind, so I'll try to like get them a little bit organized. But the first thing that I think jumps to my heart is, the style or the approach of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as mandated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن." So there is this essentializing the idea of there is the truth. So you're calling to the truth, calling to the way of Allah. Okay, and this is a Quranic dictate, if you will, referring to Allah and so on, but it applies as a principle to all of our circumstances. So I hope you
Yeah,
can like extrapolate this from
yeah.
this,
So call to
all
what is right, call to what is good,
call
call
to
to what
what
is
is good,
true.
call to
Yeah,
what is true, call to what is, essentially the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bil hikmah. You have to employ a healthy dosage of wisdom. You have to be very thoughtful and wise about how you speak, how you communicate, when you communicate, etc. But you are constantly trying to preserve and protect and call towards the truth. Um, and the reason that is the case is because رفع السماء ووضع الميزان. Allah has, he raised the sky and he placed the balance, and he tells us كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله. And conversely كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط. So both, be upholders of balance and justice, and be witnesses to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think just first and foremost, all of us have to constantly appreciate that there is such a thing as the truth, right? And there is such a thing as a virtue. And there is such a thing as principle that we should all inherently, as individuals, seek to uh, um, uphold and see preserved in society. And that is not that is not a subjective thing. It's not your truth versus my truth, right? No, it's the truth. Okay. And that's something that is to be considered. I mean, by the way, is that you can jump in off of what I'm saying. You don't have to wait for me to finish my spiel.
Well, I don't want to. I try to pick my spots because I want to let you finish your flow. I know how your mind flows, so
that's
I want
point
you to go
one.
through a full. Yeah.
If you wanna cut my flow, you wanna flow be me, go ahead.
No. I appreciate 100% what you're saying, and that goes back, I think, to my point, right? Which is, you originally started off by saying that we have these touch points, right? And one of the reasons why one of the potential doorways to chaos is allowing people's individual sort of subjective opinions to outstrip or outweigh those touch points, such as the agreements that you have between you, what's moral, what's right, what's a principled stance. But going off the ayah that you just quoted, right? Using hikmah. So if I'm dealing with someone now whose emotional state is such, or whose conviction about the reality of what just happened, right? Which is what's kind of happening in the country, right? The conviction around, for some of these people, they're convinced that, like, one part of the country is very convinced that there's this evil cabal of people who have now taken over the country, and there's a huge other portion of the country that feels like we're finally getting rid of this evil cabal, right? So there's two completely different realities, right? So what's moral and right can sometimes you may feel, from a standpoint of wisdom, I understand this is moral and right, but I also have to weigh, Sheikh Hussam inshallah will be joining us right now. I also have to weigh the impact of the firmness of my stance with how each group is going to respond, right? So on the one side, you have what I mentioned earlier, the group that might be a little bit too sensitive at this point, or if you come down hard on them, if you hold them accountable, you might lose them. And on the flip side, you have to think about, the rest of the people in that total community who feel like they've been transgressed against, rightfully so. Right. And if you just ignore the fact that they've been transgressing, you might lose them. Right. So that wisdom part is what I was trying to bring up, that, I understand that you have to have a touch point, right? Like, we have to go back to a contract, or we have to go back to what the arrangement that we've agreed to and our principles. But sometimes you feel the need to lessen the weight of the principles in the light of the way people might react. Right?
Well, that's what so the next point of the hikmah point of this ayah is precisely kind of, assessing what you're referring to here. I think I have two things I want to say in this regard. First off, the example of what's happening in the public sphere today with, the political space and the opinions of the left and the right and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, both left and right have acted so, in general, very often immorally, very often off principle, very often because of political expediency, because of hizbiyah, there's a lot of tribalism, and my side versus your side. So the problem is there is no true moral arbiter in this space. It is, unfortunately, an ugly battle of wills. I'm not saying that there is no then wrong that happens. No, there's a lot of wrong that happens in between, but the lack of accountability and the lack of principle and the lack of that, it does lead to a type of chaotic fitna, in terms of, it's like, well, who are you to even remotely claim that you have a moral authority in this space? You are more corrupt, and you're this and you're that. So I think that's something to just think about, because not in every single circumstance are things that ambiguous or muddy, right? Just kind of polluted. The waters are polluted. And so,
I think I just want to pinpoint that. I think that's a phenomenal point. And again, like the way Sheikh Sam, assalamu alaikum, we haven't.
Sheikh Sam, منور مولانا, سامحنا والله.
الله ينور علينا وعليكم إن شاء الله.
You brought a lot of nur into this space.
A lot of nur into this space.
Allah يعزك. What can I say? My office is very lighted. Alhamdulillah.
Because you're sitting in it. That's right.
يا سلام. خلاص you got me there. سلمنا.
Listen, Sheikh Sam, في الآخر, I'm going to one up you on the Egyptian stuff.
So we were talking about the balance between unity and accountability, Sheikhi. So I wanted to pinpoint Sheikh Yasser's last point. because I do think it's an important one. And again, we're not like I framed it just to recap for Sheikh Osama. I framed this conversation that while it's inspired by what's taking place in the country right now, we're not specifically discussing how that should be handled. We're more discussing what are some of the general lessons and criteria and methodologies we should take, because every communal body, every group of people that comes together, struggles with this question from time to time, and it's a frequent question that comes up. When do I hold people accountable versus when do I sort of promote unity and prioritize that? But what Sheikh Yasser just said, I have at least found to be a very important reality, which is if the leadership or the people that are guiding that group or responsible over that group at the point in time don't have at least the trust of the group as a whole to be moral and upright, and don't have sort of like the reputation for being moral, a lot of this falls apart. And this goes back, like I started the question off by saying, do we have, are there examples from the Prophet's Sunnah? And there are. And I know me and the Sheikh have talked about this prior to this episode. There are examples from the Prophet's Sirah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he's done both. He's held people accountable, and times where he's been very forgiving in the spirit of bringing people together. But never at any point was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's moral sort of standing in question, even by his worst enemies, right? Everyone knew,
always a Sadiq al-Amin.
That everyone knew Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was going to be fair, he was going to be just, he was going to be honest, right? And so like it gave him a lot of room, even to the point where he made him, I know there's a hadith of Rasulullah where he says, some of you may come to me with an issue and one of you may speak better than the other and convince me, and I would make the wrong judgment, right? But you should know that Allah knows more than I do, right? So it gave him that room to even admit at times that, look, I may not always get it right, but I'm going to be as moral as I possibly can be. And I just wanted to pinpoint, because I do think Sheikh Yasser's point there was an important one that kind of puts into perspective some of the problems that we're probably facing right now as a country.
Yeah, just to add, Maulana, I guess the example you're referring to in terms of the seerah is the Prophet ﷺ not taking decisive action against Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul and the hypocrites for the purpose of unity? Or did you guys refer to something else earlier?
I didn't bring up any on the call, but that's certainly one of the more famous ones. But I think the Prophet's seerah is like wrought with examples on both sides, where he held people accountable and where he, I mentioned to Sheikh Yasser before we started recording, the most obvious one was, to me, was the Mecca, when the Prophet ﷺ came back into Mecca and forgave people who had behaved so criminally towards their own family members for more than a decade, and he let them all go for the sake of unity, right? Like, it wasn't a time now to divide. It was a time to bring, Meccan society back together. But yes, the hypocrite issue, I think, is another like clear example.
Well, the reason why I asked the question is, I think that, just as you said, we as a Muslim community and as Muslims in general struggle with this reality as well. In the sense that, often that you find many different groups and pockets of Muslims idolizing certain figures, identifying with certain groups, tending to approach others with this attitude of, well, where do you stand? How can I label you? Are you part of this group or that group? What are you really trying to promote? What's your agenda? A lot of people deal with their relationships with that mindset. Oh, you're doing this, there must be some agenda behind it. And that's actually part of the toxicity of the times, that we begin to also interpret even just innocent actions sometimes in light of a greater agenda, our cause. And I think the struggle here is, I found personally, in my personal experience, and I'm sure Sheikh Yasser can relate, that just trying to be a genuine person, sincere person, being a person of insaf and justice, on one end, of course, embodies the prophetic ideal mentioned in the hadith, unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazluman. Be just a person of insaf. Don't be a person who ever stands with what's wrong. Don't try to get into that toxic reality of labeling yourself, I'm part of this, I'm against that, I'm going to be with this no matter the wrong in it because it's just better than the other side. That's not a prophetic approach to things. Just being a person who, I'm going to deal with each situation on its own and try to decipher the truth in this. And wherever that truth is, I'm going to follow it. I found that, dealing with people at that level is far more impactful. And this goes back to spiritual concepts and realities of ikhlas and insaf, as I mentioned. Being a sincere person, really, really, or attempting, I should say, to be a sincere person, really penetrates the hearts of people. People like, and you know what, to be honest with you, when you apply that to political reality, a lot of people, of course, it's a fictitious facade. A lot of people resorted to one of the candidates, Trump, because they were uh, distraught by a political reality that continues to make promises and breaks promises and continues to engage in a way that's so fake, superficial, opportunistic, and so on and so forth. And the politicians, they know this. So it wasn't the fact that, Trump is anywhere near being Sadiq or Amin, honest or trustworthy, but they felt that he was really genuine. They felt that he spoke his mind, even though what was in his mind was extremely toxic, but they felt it, a better option than, a politician that's going to just say a bunch of sweet words and do something else once he walks out the room.
Yeah.
And I think that's on a personal level, on a relationship level, that's critical to have, to just try to be a person who, even if it's for me or against me, I don't care. That's peripheral. I'm willing to be with something that's against me if it means that it's closer to the truth. That's not an easy quality to develop, but it's far more easier to say, you know what, I'm going to align myself with these people because that'll enable me to do X, Y, and Z. Even though I know that what these people are doing is not necessarily kosher, quote unquote, but I'm gonna do it anyways because that's the best thing that I have available to me. I think, wallahu alam, that's just a long reflection, but
No. So, subhanallah, by the way, how
Sheikh Osama داخل سخن النهارده. Like we usually build up to the rants. I didn't realize Sheikh Osama was going to come in today.
he came in
معلش
hot.
يا مولانا.
أول وهلة مولانا يعني احنا برضه مسلمين معاك.
Allah al-musta'an. Well, Maulana, Aslo, it's a sensitive subject to us all. Wallahi, all of the heated interactions that have come about because of these types of things, people and their decision-making process. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us.
I do just want to say, when you were speaking, Sheikh Osama, you reminded me of one of the famous quotes from Sidi Malcolm, rahmatullah alayh, Malcolm X, when he was asked near the end of his life, how do you want to be remembered? Right? And of course, he didn't know he had an inclination it was near the end of his life, but he was still young. But he said, at the end of the day, I hope people will know me to be sincere. I may have been wrong at times, but I was wrong sincerely. I really believed what I was doing was right. And I do think that was something that he had. And I think even people, especially within, the Black American or African American community, people who I've heard who don't necessarily align with Malcolm's general ideology, or definitely not his religious belief, always said that the great power he had over his people, not in like the manipulation standpoint, but the great power he had with his people was that they knew him to be sincere and truthful, right? So that even if they didn't agree with everything he said, he was on their side because he said he was on their side. And so you had like a massive swelling of support for him, that even when people didn't agree with him, they were willing to engage and work with, and still in general see him as a part of them, right? Because they sense this deep sincerity from him. SubhanAllah. When you were speaking, Sidi Malcolm's quote came to mind, and I felt inspired to share it. But
it's a beautiful quote.
Going back to the point that we were making, Sheikh Yasser, that was your first point, and I kind of put a pin in it so that we can emphasize it. You wanted to move on, I think, with the point of hikmah.
Yeah, so I mean, just kind of bringing everyone back to the thread of what we're thinking about is here. How do you go about negotiating a troubling situation or potentially a very tense one where you may, end up marginalizing some, or offending others, or creating some potential degree of unrest. So the idea, as we said, is to call towards the truth, to do that with a abundance of wisdom, and that requires that I speak knowing that someone may not fully understand what it is I'm saying. So it would require, or does not even fully appreciate the principles I'm articulating. I can't make the assumption that people know, why I'm saying what I'm saying, or why I'm advocating for why I'm advocating. So it is something that we should do in the space of being wise, to say, I am calling towards this particular opinion or perspective or truth, or whatever the case is, because of these reasons. Let me articulate to you the purposes of why this is. We should not assume, we should not assume that people know or don't know. Even the most evident things. You may be advocating for a particular point in any capacity, and assuming that this is the obvious thing that's right, that people should know that's right. And people may not know that. So hikmah requires this idea of ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmah. Hikmah requires a real thoughtful intentionality behind what you're articulating, what you're advocating for, etc. And then ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'idha al hasana, and use, you really do use the most beautiful of expressions. And maw'idha al-hasana is not flowery speech. No, it's not false, empty, flowery tropes that you see. For example, let me get on the microphone and almost do like a form of mudahana, just like empty, flowery speech, just kind of I'm trying to assuage the emotions of the masses. No. Speaking with ihsan can be that you're speaking very, very directly, very openly, very truthfully, and you're using language that is not nafsani in either direction. Either like I'm trying to smooth you over, so I give you a lot of flowery speech, and that's nafsani speech, or nafsani speech which I come off very angrily and aggressively, that can be munaffir in of itself. It's just ihsan is beauty and balance and excellence in approach. And then when you're in
Just real quick,
argumentation,
but when Sheikh Yasser uses the word nafsani here, he means sort of like desire-filled or egotistical or self-involved.
something that's coming from the nafs, from the base self. And then when you're in argumentation, you're employing an even more of an ihsani type of orientation. You're really kind of digging deep into your spiritual self, and your morals, and your knowledge of Allah and His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, to ensure that you have this arbiter in your heart, in your mind, that you're returning to, because it's very often, sometimes what happens is I have a subjective idea of what the truth is, and then I advocate for that quote unquote truth mercilessly, with no wisdom, no ihsan. I become a utilitarian. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The ends justify the means. I'm on the, I know what's right. I know what's just. So if it requires me to literally, literally or metaphorically, gear up and take up arms to fulfill the truth that I think, even if it requires me to do immoral or problematic or blameworthy or aggressive or harsh or harmful acts, then I may. And that's where it becomes deeply non-prophetic and veers far away from the Quranic guidance. Now,
you're just the adab police, Sheikh.
huh?
All you are is just the adab
Just the
police.
adab police. No, but I did want to comment, because I think your original point around making correctives and fearing fitna and all that kind of stuff, I'll just say, so with that type of kind of methodology in mind, I think there are times when you are going to have to uphold what's true, even if the consequence is a high degree of rejection and discord. There are times where that may be the case. um and it's when the identity, the identity, meaning the actual like essence and purpose of an organization, or an institution or a company or a government is at threat.
Yeah.
If I'm leaving things up to, okay, well, I have these two different factions and they kind of disagree on what's happening and things like that, and so I just want to assuage my goal becomes to assuage everyone's desires and wills and interests, and I remove from the spectrum the principles and the values and the morals, right? And I think many of us in different capacities have been in spaces where there is objective wrong happening, and you can identify, you can say, in accordance with our principles and our morals and our values, here are the wrongs that are happening: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there should be then a process of حكم من أهله وحكم من أهلها. Like, you have arbiters that come and people that actually sit down and assess the arguments that are being made. But the goal should be, it's like, what is the principle, what is the truth, and how do we assess who is closer to that truth, and what are we actually upholding? And
Yeah.
and in that case, depending on the parties that are involved, if people are genuine, sincere, they'll agree to that. Or if they're not, what they'll end up doing, which is very often what happens, is to just decide to maintain their salacious narrative, to continue with their propaganda, to continue with their subjective, assumptions. And no matter, they may be in their own minds very sincere, like, no, I know the truth, this guy is playing a game, okay, he's playing a game, she's this, whatever, I know what it is, so don't listen, no, it has to be this, it has to be that, because I know, wallahi, had this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nasab, don't even listen, even if he's calling you to the Quran, wallahi, even if you see him in sujood, nasab, kadhab. This is where it just gets idiotic. It's like, what are we actually advocating for here, right? Is it just khalas? And then the problem is, with the day and age that we live in, and what I would consider to be the overly democratized reality, is that everyone's shahwa becomes ra'yun mu'tabar. Everyone's base desire becomes an opinion that should be in consideration. So, when you mentioned the example of the Prophet ﷺ coming back from Medina and entering into Mecca, that forgiveness that he engaged in is what is known as al-af inda al-maqdira. He forgave when he was in a position, when the truth, the principles and the values and the virtues have been established. And it's like, you guys, this is a big grouping of people. They know who's in charge, and they know what those values and principles that he upholds are. And that's the standard that's going to now be exacted upon all of the people of Mecca and Medina. When that is firmly established, then the Prophet ﷺ chose al-af, and he could have held them accountable. He could have employed justice, if you will, but he chose af, because that is closer to the rahm, the rahimi reality of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, and this idea that when you are able to, when you have the maqdira, then yes, you forgive. I have in my own personal life have been asked to say, khalas, overlook and oversee. But if it's just me, like the Prophet ﷺ, when you think of Ta'if, it was just him. It was, not to say that's nothing, but it was the abuse that he experienced that's why the Prophet ﷺ did not have them destroyed, because huwa ja'a ala nafsihi. If you're hurting me, I'm going to forgive the hurt that you've placed upon me as an individual.
Yeah.
But for example, when the haqq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the huquq of the Muslimin, the huquq of the ibad, the rights of Allah, the rights of people, the rights of individuals are being compromised or stripped, I don't have, the luxury to forgive a transgressor and say, no, it's okay, the brother or the sister or whoever. It's like, no, you don't have that luxury, because it's not yours. It's not yours to forgive. Especially when you have objective wrongs. And even if advocating now for that is going to cause some tension, there's always going to have to be a degree of tension in the sunnah of tadafu'. You know, the idea that that there's always going to be a pushing and a pulling between ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض. If it wasn't for the fact that there's always going to be this push and pull between right and wrong, you would see destruction,
Yeah.
right? And good Muslims, good people should not assume that being good is okay. I'm just going to kind of like retreat because I just don't want to cause. I don't want to be a part. I don't want to see. So I'm just going to retreat. No, sometimes you have idfa billati hiya ahsan. Push forth with ihsan. Right. Anyway, I rambled off long
No,
enough.
Jazakallah khair, Mulana. But there was like just so many gems in what you said. But one of the last things you said, Jazakallah khair for giving the example of Ta'if. I feel it clarifies a little bit. That concept of forgiving when you're able, because some people might hear that, and I've actually dealt with this in the past. Well, you know, you know should I really forgive fulan or fulana that's from my family or my inner circles or my relationships when they haven't really apologized or they haven't really sought forgiveness? I haven't been able to take back my right from this person, and this thing is just killing me on the inside because I feel like they got away with wronging me and oppressing me. Now the situation's all said and done, but I just can't get over it on the inside. And I think that that statement is explained by the situation in Ta'if, that the individual should never allow feelings, even if justified, sentiments, even if justified, to be an anchor for them in their personal development. And I think that's the blessing of afu and forgiveness, is just it just sort of frees your conscience and frees your mind and heart from and it's not something easy to attain, but I think that's about that particular issue. But I think in general, a lot of the things you said, loaded with gems, mashallah. But it spells out the need for an individual to have a level of fiqh and understanding, when to prioritize, when should this action be taken, and when shouldn't it. And that's not something that is just that's not something that just comes without personal development, study, reflection, gaining knowledge, and that's why in certain situations, like for the example, the verse in the Quran, وَإِذَا جَاءَهُمْ أَمْرٌ مِّنَ الْأَمْنِ أَوِ الْخَوْفِ أَذَاعُوا بِهِ. In certain situations, the directive by Allah Azza wa Jal is to turn those situations back to those who are most able to handle them. فلولا وإذا جاءهم أمر من الأمن والخوف أذاعوا به. When an issue of fear or security comes to them, they begin speaking of it with propaganda, without verification, right? ولو أنهم ردوه إلى الرسول وإلى أولي الأمر منهم لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منهم. Had they brought that information back to the Prophet ﷺ and those who are in positions of influence and responsibility, then they would have known how to interpret and handle that type of situation. So just to that point that you mentioned, in our reality, we need to be able to recognize that, that certain situations need to be handled through a certain process. It's not that everyone who has an opinion should just have a weigh in and a say on equal grounds, on equal level with those who are qualified to handle those types of situations. Appreciating a process, that's something that is applicable in a lot of these emotionally charged situations, because many people, especially because of the general sentiment today, if the general sentiment today is to stand with a certain side in a disagreement, the grieving party, the oppressed party, because it hasn't been so for so long, I still need to follow a process. I cannot just jump on board and say, all right, you know what? This person says they're oppressed, so I'm going to stand with the oppressor. This person's abused, so I'm going to, and you know what? It needs fiqh. It needs understanding. We should not just go with the flow and follow whatever is, this is something that the Prophet ﷺ, he had, and, as some examples, you alluded to some examples from the seerah. One of these examples that automatically comes to mind when the Prophet ﷺ was like, the situation is not one of sacrificing principles. Some people, they say, oh, sometimes you just need to be pragmatic, and you need to make certain decisions so certain things could happen. The Prophet ﷺ said there are boundaries for that. One of those is when Banu Amir bin Sa'sa'a, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, all right, we agree, we think you have something special, but we just have one condition: make us the leaders after you. Make sure that you ascertain for us leadership after you're gone. And he said, there's no way that I could do that. Al-amru lillahi yada'uhu haythu yasha'. Or when the kuffar of Quraysh said, you know what? We want to reach to a point of peace with you, but we want you to accept our deity and our idols. So how about we just both worship each other's idols? So the Prophet ﷺ, of course, he said, if they were to place the sun in my right and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this affair. And then it continued. So there are certain situations where, you know what, I cannot just sacrifice principles because it's what everyone is doing, or it's because what will help achieve certain ends. The means don't justify the ends don't justify the means. And there's so much more that you said there, but I guess that just the thing that automatically stood out to me was that reflection. Being a person of fiqh and understanding, realizing that things need time to be cleared, verified. Certain measures should not be taken because of the consequence of them, and all the rest. Wallahu alam, yani.
Barakallah fiqh, Sheikh Sam. I do want to go back again to something that Sheikh Yasser sort of first noted, and then Sheikh Sam sort of built on. So there's two things. The first one is, you mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ had afu when he was like sort of in a position of power and the ability to show afu, right? But in Mecca, there were plenty of people who had oppressed and in some cases even killed unjustly members of some Muslims' families, right? So there were individual transgressions. And there are plenty of examples of this. Like when people would come into Islam, quite often, these were people who may have had some previous harm that they had done. And from what I can gather, from what I know, and I'm going to pose this as a question, just in case I'm wrong, what I can gather from the methodology of the Rasul ﷺ in moments like that was that he would try to inspire the person who was wrong to forgive on their own accord, right? So like so this person came into Islam, or like I'm trying to think of a good example that comes to mind. One of them is at the Battle of Badr, when they were prisoners of war. And this is not a perfect example, but the Prophet ﷺ wanted to free one of the prisoners, and he told them, like, take his thaman, like ask me for his thaman, ask me for his amount, and I'll give it to you. And the person on his own accord said, no, I'll just free the prisoner. Or the situation after Fatah Mecca, when the Prophet ﷺ was like declaring that the debts were now gone, right? And he said, I'm going to begin with my family's debts, the debts that were based on interest, right? So I can't remember any specific example off the top of my head where the Prophet extolled someone to forgive, say, the murderer of their father or their brother or their sister. But I can imagine within, like, when that community was coming back together, these were people who were at war, and these were people who had been kicked out of their homes, money had been stolen, right? I like the Prophet ﷺ seemed to have this methodology of extolling the people who were wronged to try and forgive on their own accord. If he had to, I think he would take the stance of bringing their rights. But sometimes you may, and I say that because I think sometimes when we're in a position as a community, for example, yes, someone's rights may have been taken, right? That's outside of my rights. I may be responsible over a certain subsection of the community, right? I may be asked to arbiter over something. And I see that, yes, there was a wrong here, but it's actually going to be much better for the group as a whole if this person forgives. So I may go to that person and extol them. Look, yes, you were wronged, but I think you should forgive for this reason. Would you guys agree with that? Would you push back on that? Do you think I'm sort of exaggerating that reality a little bit? Either one of you can take that one.
Osama, are you processing what else?
خش يا مولانا خش.
No, no, I mean, I think, I don't think what you're saying is problematic. I do actually, if I understood you correctly, I do agree with what you're saying. And I think that, the word that's coming to mind when you're speaking about these examples is the word reconciliation.
Yeah.
And it kind of, when you're trying to reconcile and move forward from a real communal discord, there has to be a type of forgiveness and forgetting and kind of moving on from some of the wrongs. You think of like the reconciliation that, in South Africa with Nelson Mandela and that kind of discourse. Like at the end of the day, a lot of the principles that he was articulating was the need to have a type of reconciliation that's predicated upon understanding people have been harmed, pain, hurt, etc., wrong, and just, at the very least affirming those things and identifying them and so on, but moving forward. So I definitely think there is plenty of room for that type of an idea. But once again, being able to have that luxury, if we want to call it that, for example, to move into a place of reconciliation, does require that we veered off of our path, and we're now trying to come to a place of harmony. We're trying to move into a place of, safety and security and wellness. So let's try. We went off. We warred for decades. And we battled and we fought and we lost our way. We were no longer even in a place of like meaningfulness. We just kind of, and this happens. I mean, I've seen institutions. This happens to them where they just kind of enter into
Happens to families. I think it's a very
families
common
that
thing.
it
It
just
happens within
wars. It
families.
just becomes, it literally becomes like the battles of the Jahiliyyah, like the 40-year war because a horse was killed.
Yeah.
And literally, you
Yeah.
enter into these endless wars and battle because, well, them was taken, one dem of ours was taken 40 years ago, and we will continue to bring victory. And then because someone was killed, someone else becomes killed, and then
Yeah.
it becomes a tit for tat until we're into nothingness. When you come to that point of like, okay, now we've all kind of come to our senses that this is a disaster, or that there's someone who comes in and gets involved and says, guys, we need to move this towards a place of reconciliation, then of course things are going to have to be forgotten, and justice will not be purely quote unquote served.
So there has to be a recognition from what you're saying, Sheikh, on all sides that look, there were mistakes made.
Yeah.
Everyone recognizes that they made mistakes. The principles are reestablished of what's right, what's wrong, and then you can extol the person who was wrong. Let go, like, because it's going to be better for you overall. And that kind of leads me to one of the other questions I was going to bring up, because I do think this happens quite often within families, within marriages and households, where quite often, like if there's some oppression in the household, we've seen people at times, some community leaders push one spouse, for example, to forgive and remain in the household because it's just going to be better for the family as a whole. You don't want to break up the family. And I think the principle you just brought out is a good one to sort of stick to that, because if both spouses recognize there's been some dhulm here and there's some problems that need serious fixing, maybe that makes sense. But if one spouse is just insisting that I'm going to do what I want to do because I want to do it, then maybe it's not the right time to extol the other spouse, to just keep forgiving and being patient and so on, because the actual principles of what's right and what's wrong and the recognition that there's a need for shift hasn't happened yet.
I guess to build on that, Maulana, there's a verse in the Quran that says, فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مَنْصُورًا. Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Al-Isra describes when an individual takes another life wrongfully, then the sultan or the authority, and this is actually one of the unique things about Sharia, the sultan and authority actually is in the hands of the wali, of the heirs, of the family of the wronged party, and the one whose life's been taken wrongfully. And one of the wisdoms is in that is, it's like it's part of the healing process that that no a decision isn't made for them, for or against, but rather it's brought back to them, and they have an option between one of three things. Either they choose to take their right in this dunya, which is the least favorable of them. And there's tons of a hadith actually all along that emphasize the virtue of forgiveness in that type of situation. Or they choose to give partial forgiveness, but want to be remunerated for their loss of a caregiver or whatnot, or a family member who played a certain role. Or the last one is to just completely forgive. And there's great virtue in that that's spelled out in that hadith. But nonetheless, and as to Sheikh Yasser's point, that reconciliation, this is part of that reconciliation. It's part of the healing process that the Islam empowers the grieving party. All right, you're part of this decision, is yours. Right, once the proof is established and everything is clear, now we're going to bring this back to you, and we're going to give you this advice. It's yours to choose between this. So, and I think that you're not far off in your initial reflection, Ustaz Zaid, with the whole Fatih Makkah. Imagine some of the individuals who are, among those forgiven, were leaders in the wars against the Muslim, like Abu Sufyan. Imagine all of the things that his decisions and his advice led to, or his commands. And imagine what kind of loss of life, what kind of loss of property and possession it led to. But still, he was among those forgiven. Allah alam.
You see the language of the Prophet ﷺ, ماذا تظنون أني فاعل بكم أخ كريم ابن أخ كريم اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. But you see, ماذا تظنون أني فاعل بكم. What do you think I'm going to do with you? Now that I have the sulta, I have the control, what do you think I'm going to do with you? Well, you're a generous, you're generous, you're a generous, the son of a generous, generous brother, beautiful brother, the son of a beautiful brother, generous brother. So it's so the Prophet says, go, for now you are free. And so, there is definitely room for that. But there was something, Ustaz, that you mentioned about the families. It may take us off into a different path, but it's just something that I wanted to say quickly, because I don't know that we've actually still fully resolved the question of, because there is a pressing question that has to be answered, was, when fitna is constantly invoked, or the potential of fitna is constantly invoked, what do we go about doing? Because I think there's a lot of people in spaces and communities and people who are silenced because of the fear of fitna, and they don't really speak up, or they don't say, or they don't go about trying to rectify a broken situation, because what, let's not create a fitna. Even if this is a little more wrong or ugly or evil, then just let it be as it is. And I think that's a whole conversation that we potentially have to have. But the point about like in the family space and one party always being told to forgive and forget, I think, as community leaders and as institutions, as or whoever is being an arbiter in a particular problem, there should be there should be justice, and there should be a constant need to advocate for everyone to be just and kind and thoughtful and honest and upfront, and to admit wrongdoing and that kind of nature. And then, as you mentioned, there are times where people will abide and say, oblige and say, okay, yeah, I've been wrong. And very often when people will be like, I'm never wrong, I'm always right. And this person is XYZ, right? There, there is some room for the idea of, well, for a particular pragmatic benefit that I get, I may have to just deal with this. I may have to just kind of go along with this unfortunate circumstance. This is not to say that a person does not have the right. I don't think people should be emotionally blackmailed to stay in things. It's like, if you leave, you're going to be the cause for all the pain and the suffering in the home. No, I don't think people should be emotionally blackmailed that way. That's a very ugly thing.
Mm.
However, if someone decides on their own accord to say, I understand what's right and what's wrong, I understand what's happening, but when I look at my circumstance, right, I decide for myself, knowing full well in the conscious, in like the thought, the soundness of my thought and mind and everything, that I am going to accept the brokenness of what's present. I don't think we should eliminate that possibility. That's all I want to say. I think we should give people the autonomy to make those decisions and to assess for themselves what is actually in their personal best interest. Because I think sometimes when we talk about justice, we talk about it a little bit in absolute terms, and we say, it should be this way. And if it's not that way, then, you go about and you just make sure that you pursue justice absolutely. Justice is a virtue and we should want to see it established. But people also know their circumstances. People know, are they better off this way versus better off that way? Sometimes I'll say, Sheikh Usama, you have to be liberated from your circumstance and you have to get out. And I'm your biggest proponent of you liberating yourself. And then you quote unquote liberate yourself. And then you're sitting there, standing alone in the street and you're like, I'm liberated, but I need help. Like, like, well, I mean, I did the liberation part, but the help part,
Wow.
And so it's something that I think, especially in the family space, and we're talking about turmoil between spouses, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that we should be complicit with dhulm. Okay, I don't want anyone to assume that I'm saying, oh, you should be complicit with oppression or wrongdoing. No, wrong is wrong. And sometimes if the wrong is so egregious and really, and the person is being abused and harmed mercilessly, and this person themselves has become broken, then yes, there should be intervention that says, okay, no, this cannot, there's no tolerating, for example, someone getting punched in the face every day. It's like, yeah, I know he punches me in the face every single day, but this is better for me. There should be the muhibbin of that person and the family and the hashi of that person, those around them, to say, you have to really understand what's going on and consider differently, and really strengthen and empower that person to come to a point of clarity of what's happening. But I just want to also indicate that it's not a black and white thing, and there's room to explore different possibilities at times. So that's I hope that's
no, Jazakallah khair,
your
Maulana.
thought
And
on
I
this.
think that's actually like golden, like, but yeah, I think we've, like addressed this type of thing in the past, when we spoke about like navigating imperfect realities, like that's actually like part of the process of, just try, assessing my circumstance really. Well, yeah, I know I'm dealing with this and I'm dealing with that, and this person's like this, and this person's not like that, and there might be toxicity in a relationship, but at what point do you just take a strong stance, and at what point do you try to negotiate it? Because no matter what circumstance you're in, there's going to be something to negotiate, because we're not dealing with perfect realities in our relationships, and sometimes even, just to give another example, it sometimes it's not the type of thing where you can just pick up and leave and turn your back, like your relationship with your siblings or your relationship with your parents, because some people listening might be like, well, all right, you know what, I'm going to hold my parents accountable. Hold it right there. I'm a sheikh. Well, what do you mean? When it comes to dealing with certain um, relationships, a lot of thoughtfulness needs to be had in terms of the consequences of decisions, and in terms of just dealing with the natural imperfections that come with such intimate, close relationships, especially with people that Allah Azza wa Jal has, made it a part of my personal growth, my spiritual growth, to have a certain connection with, like the parents, like siblings, like near relatives, and so on and so forth. That's one thing that was relating to what you said. The previous point also brought me back to something Ustad Zaid said. I just want to add it in there, about the whole Fath Mecca thing. The other thing that we understand from the seerah, that the Prophet ﷺ had a really, really intimate relationship with the companions. A lot of the times, even grieving and oppressed parties would defer to him to speak on their behalf. And there's so many examples of it. But just to give you an example of how intimate the relationship the Prophet ﷺ had, like with the companions, is the Prophet ﷺ, in one of the hadith, he says, أنا أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم فمن توفي وعليه دين فعلي قضاؤه ومن ترك مالا فهو لوارثه. This hadith I was recently reflecting on one of my classes, and just the Prophet ﷺ speaking in such terms. أنا أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم. I have such an intimate relationship with the believers that I'm more entitled to to them than their own nafs is entitled to them. And the Prophet ﷺ speaking in such terms shows the level of interaction he had with the companions, that you find even the Prophet ﷺ, not as a father or a brother or a blood relative, playing the position of marrying off two companions in his role as the Prophet ﷺ, or commanding one of the companions to forgive half of the debt that is due to him, to reconcile between two grieving parties. There's another hadith that shows that there was two companions. One of them was owed a debt, and the other one wasn't timely in repaying the debt. And they began fighting and shouting in the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ heard them from a distance, and the Prophet ﷺ intervened, and he went to the deserving party and the rightful party, and he said, forgive half of it and take the half. He gave them a settlement. This is a settlement. All right, he can't repay you the full amount because he doesn't have. He could pay half. You take half, and that's the end of your. So it was just another reflection that came to my mind about the Prophet ﷺ and his role with the companions.
Barakallah feekum, Shaykh. I know we're going to have to wrap up soon. I did have a couple other questions, but we are getting close to the end of our time. So I did at least want to just sort of, we went in a lot of different directions in today's conversation. I want to recap. I was taking notes throughout our conversations about some of the points that we brought up, right? So the question that we were asking was, how do you balance between this desire to keep a group together versus the desire to hold people accountable, or to stand for what's right and just. And I want to go through some of the points that I was writing down through our sort of meandering conversation, and then see if the Shaykh want to add or change anything, and then we can wrap up, inshallah, just so that we can sort of tie everything together. So the first point was that there should be an agreed upon touch point and process, right? So what is our relationship based on? What are the principles that we both believe in? What's the contract between us? And that should be referred back to as often as possible. The second thing is, if you're going to be responsible over such things, you want to make sure that you develop a reputation and a trust in yourself, right? That people around you trust that this is someone who's moral and is truthful. Even if I think they get things wrong, I can still trust that they're sincere, that they're moral, that they're truthful, that they're going to uphold what they believe to be right, and they're not just being tribalistic or selfish. The third one is to employ quite a bit of wisdom. And we spoke quite a lot about the need for emotional intelligence, understanding, and this I think goes to the point that Sheikh Osama was just referencing, understanding enough about where the people are that you're dealing with, right? Where are their emotional needs? What are they feeling? So you know how to bring the point to them. The fourth thing we mentioned was that you should be clear in why you're doing what you're doing, right? So if you're going to have to go the unity route or prioritize that over holding people accountable, you should very clearly articulate that to all the parties involved so that everyone can buy in and understand, or vice versa. If you're going to have to punish someone or hold someone accountable, you should be very clear in that speech. Don't just assume that people are going to understand why. The fifth one that we discussed was you have to protect the rights and the principles, or Sheikh Yasser put it, the identity, right? Objectively needs to be protected. So long as those principles, the identity of the group as a whole is protected at the end of the day, you have some room to maybe overlook transgressions. even if there was objective wrongs. But if that's in question, or you overlooking those wrongs is going to put the identity or the principles themselves in question, then that's not a time to prioritize unity. It's a time to prioritize accountability. And then once the rights and principles are clearly established, the identity is protected, you can then sort of extol people towards forgiveness, reconciliation, coming together, even if there were wrongs that were not going to be righted. So those were the 6 points that I sort of gleaned from the conversation we were having. I don't know if either one of my two shiyukh want to add, take away, comment before we wrap up the conversation, inshallah.
I know, I mean, I think that was very beautifully done. Barakallah fikum. I hope you do that every week. You can clean up everything we've done.
Well,
Go ahead.
I don't have anything to say.
Oh no, so I was going to say that I think you know, the seerah, when you look at the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, it was never a straight line. You know, there was always give and take. There was moments where things were really difficult and hard, and you would look at it and say, wow, this is really, really intense, and the harm is great, and the tension is great. Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have to understand, he introduced, through just being a Muslim, so much tension into society. Like, you know, Islam caused the problem in society. You know, if you will. Of course, Islam is not a problem, a'udhu billah, but in the
that's
sense
definitely
of
getting once people know who Sheikh Yasser is, that's getting edited, snifted, and put it up online by everyone. Right? Islam caused problems in society.
It's
Maulana.
meaning that there was a status quo in the Arabian Peninsula, and the introduction of the theology of Islam did bring a type of disruption to that status quo, and it was definitely beautiful, and it was the necessary light that was needed in a world that was replete with darkness. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that, you know, sometimes when you're trying to do what's right, it's gonna be tense and difficult and tough, and there may be a pushback, and there may be a lot of pushback, and there may be some degree of unrest. And it's important that we kind of understand that there is a percentage of that when you're trying to do what's right. And I think we tend to assume that being merciful or compassionate means that we never ruffle feathers, that we never, you know, kind of bring unrest to the waters. That's not the case. Prophet ﷺ advocated for what he advocated for. He pushed for what he did. He did it with ihsan. He did it with hikmah. He did it with the disposition of being a sadiq al-amin, being sincere, and doing what, you know, is in line with the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he followed the pathway of that was prescribed upon him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we also have to realize that in our own journeys in life, as long as we are objectively following a divinely and prophetically oriented mandate, and we're using and we're employing all of the methods and the approaches, then inshallah ta'ala we're on a good path, even if there's some fallout, even if there's some unrest, even if there's some difficulty. And you know, we shouldn't just advocate for some false semblance of harmony, just because, like, you know, let's just kind of keep things as they are, because, like, who cares, just let it be, don't make a big deal out of things, just relax, like, whatever, it doesn't matter, you know, nothing matters, just everyone be quiet, everyone go, you know. No, there's haqq, there's truth, and there's falsehood.
I think just I'm so sorry to cut you off, Sheikh, but I
No,
also
please
think
do.
like the Quran also, like, you know, it gives the characteristics at times of some of the believers who stand for what's right. وَلَا يَلُمُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ, right? They don't worry about the blame of
لا
وَلَا
يخافون.
يَخَافُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ, right? They don't fear the blame of the blamers, which I actually think is sometimes a bigger reason why people don't stand up. Because it's like, well, I'm not sure if I'm right, and I don't want to be blamed for being the one who causes division, right? So the Quran says, like, at times you're going to have to stand up for what's right, and there's going to be people who blame you for that, and just don't fear them, right? Just push forward.
Barakallahu fikum.
Yeah, you know, I guess anything I would conclude with Maulana is just, yani, in addition to what Maulana Sheikh Yasser just said, yani, realize that people in our relationships, with the bad things that come out from them, that need to be addressed and corrected, we should never lose sight of the goodness that's in people. We should never allow ourselves to approach situations, even when there's some amount of injustice that's done, in which we begin to like sort of cancel out certain individuals, and do a cancel, have a cancel culture in our relationships. That's not something that's proper. That's not something that's prophetic either. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he confronted one of the companions who was gonna do treason, that companion who sent a letter to the people of Mecca, telling them that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his soldiers are coming, Muhammad and the companions are coming. When he confronted him, Sayyidina Umar wanted the Prophet ﷺ to take aggressive action, but the Prophet ﷺ said, Umar, leave him be, because he's from the people of Badr. This is a person who has done acts of goodness, and I'm not going to lose sight of that, because you don't know. Perhaps Allah Azza wa Jal has looked at the people of Badr and said, do as you may, for I've forgiven you. So I really think that's an important attitude to have towards relationships. Yes, sometimes a lot of negative things are going to come out on the tongues of people, and sometimes I'm going to need to hold people accountable. But just because something has happened that should have never happened, doesn't mean I'm going to just put an X on this person and I'm going to refuse them in entirety. Wallahu alam.
Don't let one bad act define the person. And trying to find the good in them. And I think one of the points Sheikh Yasser was trying to get to before that was that this is an art form way more than it is a science. Right? It requires a lot of fen. It requires a lot of feeling things out and understanding the scenario as they sit. Barakallah fikum, Shuyukhi. I know it was a more sort of involved topic today. I appreciate you guys sort of working through it with us. We didn't get to the second topic I wanted to get to, but I'm glad, alhamdulillah, that the topic went a lot longer than I thought. Inshallah, we'll try to get to the thoughts topic next week. And on the 29th, inshallah, we will have our next AMA. Just announcing it now for all the audience. So if you have questions, you can start to send them in to Sheikh Osama's or the ICPC Clifton number that Sheikh Osama and I have access to all the time. Or you can send them in through Facebook and just get them to us that way. You can start prepping your questions for January 29th. Inshallah, we'll have our next AMA. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, to accept this from Sheikh Yassin, Sheikh Osama, and myself, and from the whole audience who've attended. Anything we said that was good was from Allah. Any mistakes we made was obviously from us, and we ask Allah's forgiveness. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us sincere and brings us benefit from this, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair to everyone for spending the time with us. We'll see you guys next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.